The Improved Science of Politics and the Extended Republic, Lecture 4. So in this final lecture, I'm going to explain why James Madison argues that in a large republic such as the Union, the Federal Union of the United States, it is unlikely that the government will be dominated by any faction, even a majority faction, and instead will have representatives that are good trustees or stewards of the public good. So he says on page 77 that there are two reasons why he thinks that there is a good chance you'll have good representatives this way. The first one might seem kind of abstract, but his point is this. He says, look, there's an upper limit and a lower limit to how many representatives you can have. There is a lower limit in the sense that, if you only elect two people, you don't really have representative government. It has to be big enough that it can capture and deliberate about all the relevant aspects of society to their legislation. So your legislature has to be at least a certain size. I mean, if you had a legislature that was only made up, even of like 15 people, I mean, that's a little bit too close to a conspiracy or something like that. So you need to have a good sized legislature. But there's an upper limit too, because if the legislature gets too big, it's not going to be able to carry on business, right? You're going to end up with basically a sports stadium full of people who are shouting. So in order to be adequately representative, your legislature has to be big enough. But in order to be able to actually debate and deliberate and conduct business, it can't be too big, So you've got kind of like a range in there. And then basically his argument is within that range, what that means then is that the larger your society is as a whole, the bigger the talent pool you're going to have to be able to choose representatives from. And you can think about this in terms of a thought experiment. Let's say that in any given society, there's really only about 10% of that society that would actually make good politicians, like 10%. So your talent pool is going to be 10%. Okay. And let's say any adequate legislature has to be, 50 people. You're going to have to elect 50 representatives. Okay. So if your society is only, 1,000 people, then what that will actually mean is you're only going to have a talent pool really of about 100 worthy candidates to choose from to fill 50 seats. So that's pretty good. But if your society is, instead of 1,000, let's say it's 10,000 people, then you're going to have 1,000-person talent pool, out of which you only need to pick 50. So you're going to have a lot more people available. And what that means in general is that your odds of having, the larger your society is, the better your odds that the people who get elected are going to be worthy citizens. Now, again, I should say that Madison's reasoning here is based on the assumption that candidates will be judged on individual merits by voters, which happens sometimes. But obviously, with the invention of the party system, a lot of times people vote purely on the basis of party affiliation. And of course, if you're primarily judging on the basis of party affiliation, but you don't actually know much about the character or the track record or the qualifications of the person you're voting for, that makes it possible to elect people that aren't particularly good representatives. But Madison's not, he's not considering that here because he didn't think that politicians would be running as representatives of parties. He thought that they would be running basically as individuals, saying, vote for me because I will represent, you, my constituents, well. So the first argument is, since republics can be, since large republics have a larger talent pool to choose from in terms of representatives, you've got better odds in a large republic than in a small republic that you'll actually have good and worthy representatives. And he notes another thing about it where he says, and this is the last full paragraph on page 77, where he says, in the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried. And the suffrages, that is the votes of the people being more free, will be more likely to center on men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. So in other words, the idea is that when you have a larger republic, each representative is going to represent a larger number of people. And the larger the number of votes you need to get, the harder it is to do things like buy votes, just simply like hand out money or like offer free drinks or, whatever. There are various ways, or there are various practices that have been used to illegally carry elections. And just part of his point is it's going to be a lot harder for unworthy candidates to get themselves the votes they need, the larger the group that they represent is. So larger republics have a larger talent pool and also have larger constituencies, making it harder for unworthy candidates to get themselves all the votes they need. Whereas, his point is somebody with genuine merit and a good public record, somebody who's well regarded, that's the kind of person that is most likely to be able to attract a large number of votes from a large constituency because they're already going to have a publicly established reputation. Right? So they're going to be kind of a known quantity, a proven quantity, and so much more likely to get the votes of the free votes of a large number of people than just some nobody or some scoundrel who's out there trying to bribe people. Okay. Now he notes, though, he says, look, on the other hand, it is possible for constituencies to get too big. Can one person adequately represent the interests of like 2 million people? Probably not. I think Madison might even think that it'd be pretty hard for a representative to adequately represent the interests of 800,000 people, even though that's what they do nowadays. But he says, but that's not really that big of a deal for us. This is on page 77 through 78, because he says the United States is a federal republic. And so a lot of the business of government is being done at the local level or at the state level. So obviously you can see how it would be, an argument could be made. Look, if you represent too many people, you just simply cannot get to know them adequately enough to represent them. Even if you're not slavishly deferring to their opinions, you still need to know what the people you represent think, what their interests are, what their opinions are, what their concerns are. You need to know that stuff. The more people you represent, the harder it is to represent all of that. And Madison says that's true. That's true. There comes to be a certain point when the people, there are just too many people. But he says, again, that's not a concern in our federal republic, because most of the concerns that people have, most of the opinions and interests that people have, are concerns and interests that are actually relevant not to the national government, but to the state governments. So remember, in the proposed Constitution, the federal government had a fairly limited role to play in the domestic life of the nation. Interstate commerce, weights and measures, customs houses, the postal service. There were things that the federal government did, but not a huge number of things. Most of the responsibilities of government were fulfilled by the state governments. And obviously at the state level, constituencies are much smaller, right? So the representatives in the legislature of Texas each represent a smaller number of people than our federal representatives do, right? Because it's a smaller community. So if you have a 100-person legislature and it's representing 1 million people, then you're going to have smaller constituencies than if that 100-person legislature is representing 10 million, for example. So Madison's point is, for a lot of the concerns of government, the relative representative you're going to be talking about is your state representative. And at the state level, constituencies are small enough that state reps can really get to know their districts really well because they're relatively small. Now, that's not going to be the case for federal representatives. But again, it doesn't actually matter that much because according to the principle of enumerated powers, there are only a few things that the federal government's doing. So your federal representative doesn't need to know, for example, about your religious opinions. Like that's not relevant to federal legislation under the original Constitution. Your federal representative under the original Constitution doesn't need to know your opinions about public safety, doesn't need to know your opinions about education, because those are things handled by your state representatives in your state government. The federal government's just doing a few big picture things. And so given the limited number of tasks of the federal government, it is possible for federal representatives to represent a large number of people, but nonetheless have the relevant knowledge of their constituents about the particular issues that federal representatives are concerned with. So they can get to know the opinions and interests of a large constituency because there are only a few of those opinions and interests that they need to get to know in order to fulfill their job as a federal rep. So, yeah, it could be the case that a constituency could get so big that it can't be adequately represented, but that's not going to happen with the federal government, according to Madison. Now, again, this is a larger concern nowadays because the federal government does so much more. So one could ask, maybe districts are too big to be genuinely representative today, given all the things that representatives need to know. But even if you grant that, the counter would be, so are you saying we need even more than 435 members of the House of Representatives? Do you think the quality of legislative output in the House is going to get better if we double its size? You think 800 people can deliberate together? I don't think so. So it's just sort of you're in a bind with reality. So this has to do with the question of the scheme of representation, right? So republic is better than a democracy, and a large republic is better than a small republic because a large republic, on the one hand, is more likely to have better representatives. But then there's the other side of it. Alongside the scheme of representation, there's just the sheer question of size. And here he argues, that the other advantage of a large republic is in fact that it makes it extremely hard for majority factions to form, and even if they form, extremely hard for them to act. And this is what he talks about on page 78, where he says, the other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of republican than of democratic government. And it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. So the smaller the society, the simpler the society. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Right, so the smaller the society, the fewer the factions. But the fewer the factions, the more likely that one of them actually is a majority faction. But when you have a majority faction, if it's a relatively small society, it's a lot easier for a small number of people who are close together to actually get together and act than it is for a large number of people spread out over a large area. Right. So in a small republic, you are much more likely to have a majority faction that is also capable of mobilizing and doing damage. But as he goes on to say, extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or, if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and act in unison with one another. So, in other words, when you have a really large society, you're more likely to have lots of factions. But when you have lots of factions, it's much less likely that one of them is going to be so big that it can simply dominate the rest because it's a majority. So the larger your society is, the more diverse your society is. The more diverse your society is, the more factions you have. But the more factions you have, the less likely it is that any one of those factions is big enough to actually control the government. So in this sense, the large size is actually an advantage with respect to faction. Not in the sense that it prevents factions as such, but that it prevents majority factions. And that's the key. That it prevents majority factions. So that's kind of the main argument. And then the other one, which I think is less relevant today, is the geography argument. Because his other point is, even if you have a majority faction, if it's a large country and a large number of people, and they're like spread out all over the country, it's going to be really hard for them to conspire and to act. because you just have to overcome great distances and all that kind of stuff. I say that's a little bit less relevant nowadays because, with the invention of the telegraph and the telephone and the automobile and, the train and the plane and the cell phone and the satellite and all that, it's, we can very easily communicate and coordinate action over large distances, over the entire globe. Advances in communication and transportation technology, which is what, drives globalization, these advances in communication and transportation technology mean that geography is really not so much an obstacle to majority factions anymore. But it is still the case that when you have a large and diverse society, it's much harder to actually have a majority faction. And so what this kind of comes down to for Madison, as he makes clear at the end of Federalist 51, is this. In order to make laws, you need to put together a majority. If there is no one group that actually comprises a majority, then the only way you get business done in the government, the only way you get legislation done as the government, is for different groups, none of which is a majority by itself. So groups of minority, factions who have to come together, like kind of as a coalition, to form a majority. But when you have different groups with different interests and they're trying to work together towards a common goal, that almost inevitably involves compromise on things. So no faction simply gets what it wants. And usually in that process of compromise, it is the more extreme demands, sort of relative to kind of public opinion, it's the more extreme demands that are the ones that have to be given up. So if you belong to some group and you want legislation that's sympathetic to your cause, usually you're going to have to moderate your demands in order to make them such that other people who don't share all of your ideas and interests are nonetheless willing to support it. Right? So you have to form coalitions. And you can see that in American party politics, that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are not monolithic. They are internally diverse. They are made up, and this is the language that comes up in the media sometimes. They're made up of factions. And those, the classic factions, the Democratic Party, you've got the organized labor, you've got racial minorities, you've got sort of like a good government, sort of public policy reformers. Nowadays, you've got environmentalists and other things like that. So like the Democratic Party is made up of factions, kind of, I think, today most obviously represented, or for several years most obviously represented by this kind of division between sort of the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and the, kind of Hillary Clinton / Joe Biden / Barack Obama wing, kind of the moderate wing and the left wing. And in the same way, the Republican Party has different factions. You got the pro-business, you've got the sort of the religious conservatives, you got rural voters. So, both parties are not monoliths. They're actually made up of factions that have to kind of make compromises with one another in order to build a common platform. And Madison's main point is you are much less likely to have legislation that blatantly disregards the public good or blatantly violates the rights of fellow citizens if it has to be the result of compromise and coalition building. And in that sense, that's one of the kind of the enduring relevance of Federalist 10 is that to this day, it is broadly speaking correct to say that in our large and diverse country, the way that you have a ruling majority is through building a coalition of factions who must compromise in order to work together. And that's Madison's argument. He ends Federalist 10 by saying, I'm not saying any of this reasoning applies to the states. The states are smaller communities. They are less diverse than the Union as a whole. So it is quite possible, he thought. In fact, we know from other things he wrote, he thought it was probable that there would be factions that would dominate state governments from time to time. But he didn't think that held true for the federal government, which he thought by and large would be free of outright domination by factions. So here you have this wonderful, what might seem like a kind of counterintuitive conclusion on Madison's part. If your problem is faction, the solution to your problem is to make more factions, right? Because if you don't have enough factions, then factions are going to be a problem. But if you have lots of factions, then factions aren't going to be a problem, right? It sounds kind of paradoxical, but that's his point. So since faction is unavoidable, you want to multiply them so that you have no majority faction, and they're forced to compromise in order to get anything done. So that's Federalist 10. In the next series of lectures, we're going to talk about the series of Federalist papers that culminate with Federalist 51, which is an explication both of the principle of separation of powers and also of the importance of checks and balances, the importance of these sort of extra limitations built into the Constitution. So that will be the next lecture.